The outrage at the remarks of an octogenarian billionaire with predictably dubious business and romantic interests, followed by his swift excision from the National Basketball Association, was yet another teacup storm out of an everyday sort of a day in post-racial America. As Ji Song Zhang asked in the Huffington Post, how big a deal were Sterling's remarks, really? When Donald says to his girlfriend, "Don't bring black people to my games," is he not echoing the sentiments of many unknown, less wealthy perhaps, Donalds? Sterling's words disturb, not because they are thought, but because they are uttered. The problem people have with talking about race preserves it, even in a time that many have said is post-racial. In spite of the sensationalism of a story like the Donald Sterling one, the most striking thing about race is how often it is not spoken about, particularly in Europe, despite, as Alice Weinbaum has noted, its centrality, and I quote, within transatlantic modernity's central intellectual and political formations. As Paul Gilroy reminds us, race is generally not thought of as something that structures the life of the post-imperial polity. Whole books can unironically be written on the nation state or sovereignty or on the idea of Europe or even on borders and migration without race getting much of a mention, if any at all. Recently, for example, I carried out some research into the elision, neglect, or denial of race and racism in the work of European leaders in the field of migration, ethnicity, and minorities research, not my terminology. Based on an analysis of their most cited and their most recent work, I found that race and racism are barely mentioned. They usually make up around 0.01% of the text. And where they are written about, it is most often to argue that they should be relativized in discussions of Europeans' relationships to its constitutive outside, as Stuart Hall put it. But if race doesn't feature in critical analysis, the ways in which it often shapes the most common of everyday events is most certainly hardly considered, except by those whose lives are, in fact, structured by race. At best, Sterling and his ilk are dismissed as embarrassing buffoons, throwbacks to a bygone era, which, again, as Ji Song Zhang says, are not thought to exist, and I quote, outside of the curriculum of history classes or the grainy black and white footage of documentary films. And that too only in America. Because in most European countries, the curriculum evokes race only in relation to the extremes of the Nazi final solution, almost as though the self-declared finality of the genocide of 6 million Jews ended racism itself. As David Goldberg wrote in 2006, Auschwitz has left us unable to speak about race. It has therefore been buried, but buried alive. Today, he says, the very histories of racial power and privilege are erased, burying them alive but out of recognizable reach, thus wiping away the very conditions out of which guilt could arise. He calls this the denial of denial. No guilt because there is nothing recognizable to be guilty about. And yet, when I wrote my paper, Europe and the Silence About Race, in 2008, I presented it at a number of conferences. And the recurring refrain went, but hang on a minute, how can you say there's a silence about race when it seems that we're always talking about it? One questioner at a conference in the UK said, but we have the Commission for Racial Equality. Well, we did have then, but within months of that event, actually, it had been abolished.